no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
Welcome to the Rescue Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the trolley, or forbidden transit. Now, why would we classify a trolley as a forbidden transit system? We see many examples of trolleys in our various explorations, and yet, for whatever reason, despite the fact that our society is focused on achieving cleaner, greener energy now in this contemporary era, we seem to have forgotten about the trolley in a lot of respects. I remember how I was first exposed to the trolley. It was on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I always remember the trolley coming in. That was the very first time I saw one in my life, because there were certainly no trolleys in the Midwest United States where I grew up in. Now, if you grew up in San Francisco or somewhere else, you saw the trolley. What exactly is the official historical account behind the trolley? Well, here in this image from Washington, D.C., we're seeing how the trolleys operated. We're told that trolleys began as horse-drawn vehicles, especially in Europe in the early 1800s. And I'm also going to refrain from using 19th and 20th century, as that can be a little confusing. So in the early 1800s, this is what we had: horses that pulled trolleys around. Now, it is possible for horses to do this, although is this the most efficient arrangement? And why on earth would you want to establish a vehicle or something like this, the streetcar? Trolleys are also called trams, and I know some people get very wrapped around the bend about exactly what you're supposed to call it, but they're known as trams, trolleys, streetcars. The whole concept, though, of having horses pull trolleys is quite intriguing, because it seems as though it'd be a little bit of a logistical challenge, because you have all those animals in a small amount of space, and then, of course, those animals do things, such as defecate, and you have to remove the defecation. And we often talk about that in our early images of the cities. There's also the challenge of the animals having limitations on them. Now, our official history tells us that over time, eventually, the trolleys evolved with an electrical system, and some were even gas-powered in due time. But an intriguing aspect that we see in these trolleys, in these old images, that they had a lot of different uses. And there also seems to be something, dare I say, out of place with having horses pull these trolleys around. Now, the whole concept of having train tracks with wheels and very limited contact space between the wheels and the tracks is the very principle behind the train, and why a train does not take that much tractive force to pull a large or heavy vehicle. So that's why I say it's possible that horses could do it. But as time went on, they evolved, and then they adapted the electrical system. And we've seen the trolley in many of our explorations that we've done. Now, what we believe, and what a lot of our mainstream historical accounts will tell us, is that the trolley only operated in the major cities: Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, the other major cities of the United States and Europe, and elsewhere in the land that employed the trolley. It was a very efficient mass transit system, and it allowed people to get around the city. But would you be surprised to know that the trolley was not confined to the large cities, as they were at that time? For example, here we have the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and we looked at that building before, and here we see many trolleys or streetcars or trams lined up, along with some horses. Quite a parade going on, and a very interesting image that provides different clues. Now, just imagine, though, if you had trolleys not just in every city, but also in the small towns. Now, you might be asking, well, Aurelian, I think you're going a little too far out there, because why would there be trolleys in small town USA or small town Europe? Well, would you be surprised to know that we do actually have some documentation, so you could say it is quote-unquote well documented, that we have trolleys that were used in small towns. And not just any small towns, but some of the smallest towns in the United States. And small towns that were small in the 1800s, and they're still small to this day. In fact, when we look around here, we see in Tama, Iowa, we have a trolley. Now, this is interesting because Tama, Iowa, a town of only a couple thousand people, it's always been a small town and likely always will be a small town. They have a picture of a trolley next to their major hotel, which is concealed by these trees here in this image, and very interesting image that it is. I recall seeing a postcard, though, where it said that the trolley was added later, a postcard of Tama, Iowa, as it is. But there's also other towns around the Midwest, small towns that seem to employ the trolley. Now, why exactly would these small towns need the trolley? And not to be derogatory towards Tama, Iowa, but frankly, I could run through that town in just a few minutes on feet. Why exactly do you need a trolley to go through Tama, Iowa? or a trolley in some of these other towns, whether you're in Wisconsin, Missouri, or even the small towns in Virginia, as it is, again, well documented that trolleys operated in these small towns. Now, let's think about this. If this was a trolley transit system, would it just operate in the small town, or would it actually be part of a larger system? For example, here we're in Appleton, Wisconsin. Appleton. I wonder if one of those individuals pictured there is Willem Dafoe's grandfather, as Willem Dafoe is from Appleton, Wisconsin. In fact, could one of those individuals be Willem Dafoe? Isn't it amazing how often that guy seems to crop up, Mr. Michelangelo himself? Anyway, back on topic. We have the trolley, though, in many small rural communities, and what I'm suggesting is perhaps the trolley infrastructure was a lot more extensive than we're led to believe. Perhaps it was really the mass transit system, especially in the United States and quite likely Europe as well, where we had all the communities connected, and it worked quite well and quite efficiently. Now, we think about our theories of a previous civilization that no doubt used the trolley system. And if you think about it, if you have a mass transit system that facilitates rapid transport from the rural areas to the cities, suddenly it completely changes the dynamic of how your cities operate with your population. A lot of people have asked me questions in terms of how populated do I think the cities in the old world or the previous civilization really were? Well, we don't know. And we also have to consider the fact that if we had the ability to achieve rapid transit from the rural areas to the cities, and it was feasible, and you were able to do it without having gridlock or vast amounts of traffic and the inability of people moving from small rural communities to cities in a rapid amount of time, it completely changes the dynamic of a civilization. Now just imagine if you did have a reliable mass transportation system. Now it is true that we do have some examples, and we will be exploring the subway in due time, especially the New York City subway. But you can see where mass transit would work, as opposed to, say, Los Angeles, where you don't really have an effective mass transit system, and you're reliant on your car. Although ironically, when we look at the mainstream account for the official demise of the trolley, we'll see that the car, or the automobile, as Mr. Worf would say, had a lot to do with it. Some of these images, though, really strike our imaginations because we're able to see how the trolley affected life at that time and how different that would have been. And if you think about it, let's just say you live in a small town and you're able to jump on the trolley, and then 20 minutes later you're in downtown Chicago. That has a completely different look. Now, we can compare and contrast this to what we have with the subway in New York City, where you're up on 110th and Cathedral, you hop on the subway, and then the next thing you know, you're on 5th Avenue. Okay, there's a few stops, but it's relatively efficient and it works very well. Nice building here in the background of this particular image. So we see so much with a lot of these trolleys, and we can get an idea of what capability they had. Here's an image from Hurley, Wisconsin. Now, Hurley, Wisconsin is not a very large populated town. Population of maybe 1,500 to this day, and certainly not ever exceeding that, and yet they had a trolley that ran right through the town. Quite interesting. Not only did they have a trolley, they also had a very nice county courthouse there as well, with a rather castle or manor-like appearance to it as well. Although it's no longer a courthouse, it's now a museum, at least we can take comfort or solace in the fact that it still stands as a museum. I would like to visit this one as well. Indeed, Hurley's been added to my explorations list. And not only did they have trolleys, they apparently also had a trolley that had a snow removal capability. What a novel idea! So, an electric-driven vehicle in a very small town, nice building again, in Hurley, Wisconsin. Not a very large town, and yet they had the ability to employ trolleys, and not just trolleys or streetcars, but also in a snow removal capacity. Unfortunately, the trolley eventually vanished, and here we have the last streetcars operating in Detroit. And in our exploration of Detroit, we certainly saw what an incredibly beautiful city it was in the past. And so we can see that for whatever reason, the trolleys were removed from the urban areas. And then we ask, well, why exactly were the trolleys removed from the smaller towns? And the answer will be, well, if they were removed from the urban areas, and the infrastructure and the financial support to continue them just simply wasn't there. We're going to take a closer look, though, at what our official account is for why we decided to remove trolleys from our mass transportation system. I mean, if you really think about this, an electrically driven vehicle, and we can see the trolley map here in Atlanta, Georgia. Isn't this intriguing, though, because we also see this 1902 map showing the trolley lines in Atlanta, Georgia, or the streetcars, or the trams. And we also see the town of Decatur, Although when we recall our Atlanta exploration, we might remember that Decatur was established before Atlanta was. Very interesting. When we see these images, though, it's very obvious that they still use the electrically driven trolleys with the horse-driven trolleys. Now, why exactly was that? Was it just because of the availability? We're told that in places like New York City, they had to forbade horses from moving around in Manhattan because there was too much defecation. And again, looking at this picture, we see almost a conflicting account in the picture itself, with the electrically driven trolley and then the horse-driven trolley. Now, the other thing we always talk about is, where were the vast stables for all the horses that operated in the cities at that time and made the cities operational? Because we're told they weren't relying on trolleys. We contrast this with the Watertown Historical Society, or the Hysterical Society, as some of my contemporaries used to call it, in Wisconsin, and we can see how they're supposedly laying lines for the trolley cars to operate, and then we see their current historical society, and yet we have lines established. So again, another conflicting account. There's also a lot of variance with the types of trolley or streetcars that we see, with different design types, and yet they seem to have a wide variety of capabilities. And I have to admit, I'd never seen the image of the snow removal trolley, or tram, or streetcar that we saw in Hurley. And then even other small towns, whether we're in Virginia or essentially anywhere in the land where you have these wires that were established rather quickly. Of course, then we still have the question in terms of the other older city photos that we've seen. What exactly were all the wires? Because some seem a lot more extensive than simply to operate trolleys or telegraphs. So, going on with the theory, it appears that the previous civilization did have an extensive mass transit system. Now, what would be the purpose of trolleys? Well, deconflict that with what's going on with the possibility of airships. Now, we're going to be exploring airships as part of a live stream exploration this coming weekend. But what would be the advantages of having a reliable mass ground transit system mixed in with an air transit system? What kind of capabilities would that give you as a society and a civilization? Also imagine if you had more advanced construction capabilities. And of course we can see in this image the unfortunate reality for the end of the great trolley or the streetcar in many American cities. And yet many of these look in pristine condition now, even as they're piled for demolition, salvage, or scrapping. So it paints many different pictures in terms of what was really going on with the trolley. I also appreciate the fact that now we have a trolley that's essentially a bus and you can go around in St. Louis. That building behind there looks rather familiar. Trying to remember where I've seen that before. Yes, they do have one that goes right up to the Basilica of St. Louis, and I highly recommend it. It's probably one of the best ways to get around there. But we have maps of other great cities, such as Buffalo, which we've explored, and we can see just how extensive and in-depth this transit system was. And Buffalo seeming to be a prime example of one of the great hubs or one of the great cities in the pre-existing civilization, and it had a very well-developed infrastructure. Even Des Moines, Iowa had a rather extensive trolley system and network of lines that ran through the entire city. Quite interesting given the rapid development of Des Moines, which we've explored quite extensively, and I highlight it to say that once again it's no exception from the trolley system that existed at that time. And indeed, many of the university and colleges had trolleys or electric railroads in the early 1900s that ran right up and through the campus, and there were numerous depots to where the students could rapidly commute from wherever they were living. What a novel idea! And how efficient as well that you could quickly move students around, even in small colleges such as the Iowa Agricultural College, now known as Iowa State University. And we're not going to be talking about any of the symbols that we may see at Iowa State University, but we are going to show that it's very clear they had an electric railroad. And indeed, there's still an old station there that's been converted to a student break area, and there's lots of lovely vending machines there. So we can see there are numerous examples of how the trolley operated. Now, it's considered a little bit of a link to a lost era in America, or the United States, at least that's how I'll say it, and you don't see as much in terms of reference to the trolley in Europe, although it is quote-unquote well documented that it existed there as well, and you can find numerous images of trolleys operating in large European cities. And yet other images such as this, which seem to really clue in to how widespread the trolley truly was. It was not limited to the cities. It was in the rural areas. Now, what makes more sense to you? Are we to believe our official account that trolleys really did develop in the cities and then they just happened to get an electric trolley in every single small town, especially across the United States, to include Tama, Iowa, Hurley, Wisconsin, Virginia, and everywhere else that you could possibly imagine? Or is it more likely that we really have a pre-existing mass transit system of trolleys that were repurposed, reactivated, salvaged, and as the technology developed, or as the technology was rediscovered or disclosed, whatever theory you want to go with, that the current civilization was able to reactivate them for a period of time, and that they used them until they no longer had their uses and therefore they had to be discarded. And we'll find many examples in numerous images, and you can find in every historical society across the United States that it is very well documented, the extensive use of the trolley, streetcar, tram, every city, every small town. But what exactly was the story behind the demise of the trolley, especially in the United States? Why did such an efficient and even, dare I say, a very preferred energy usage mass transit system suddenly become discarded, especially at the time frame it was discarded? Well, let's take a look at that account and see what it tells us. So we're going to take a look at an article from our good friends at Vox. Now, I'm not exactly preferential to doing this type of exploration, but I feel that highlighting some elements of this article will tell us the story, especially from the mainstream, behind the demise of America's once mighty streetcars. And this was written by Joseph Stromberg, May 7th, 2015, so about 9 years ago, but he does provide a very good point-by-point account for how the mighty streetcar diminished, and gives us some figures here. Back in the 1920s, most American city dwellers took part in public transportation, 17,000 miles of streetcar lines across the country. Certainly not comparing to the rail lines, but quite extensive nonetheless, and we have to wonder about that. Here we go. There's this widespread conspiracy theory that the streetcars were bought up by a company, National City Lines, which was effectively controlled by GM, so that they could be torn up and converted into bus lines. And indeed, it's also a plot point of the 1980s film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. At least there was an element about buying up the streetcar there so they could build the interstate. But I digress. But that's not actually the full story. Of course, it never is. But it is part of the story. So is this a conspiracy theory that's been debunked, or is this merely a partially true conspiracy theory? Once again, conflicting accounts in this article. By the time National City Lines was buying up these streetcar companies, they were already in bankruptcy. I see. So they're going to tell us that it was because of the needs and desires and the will of the people that they had provided them the automobile, which was quite affordable in the early 20th century, that it ended the golden age of the streetcar. And indeed, they recount in the 1800s how the animal-drawn streetcar lines, and there's nothing questionable about that, were across the United States. And we're not even going to talk about the ones in the small towns because they just don't count. We'll just highlight some of the larger ones in the city. And what's also interesting in this article is that it talks about some major depots that we don't think about as mass transit cities, such as Atlanta. I guess they'd never heard of MARTA in Atlanta, which moves a paltry 50 million people every year. Oh well. The decline of the streetcar after World War I, when cars began to arrive on city streets, is often cast as a simple choice by consumers. Of course, what else would it be? As a Smithsonian exhibition puts it, Americans choose another alternative, the automobile. The car became the commuter option of choice for those who could afford it, and more people could do so. Now, how exactly was it more people could afford the car? Well, we know the official story because Henry Ford came up with the rapid assembly line process, because we never had the assembly line process before, except, of course, for when they did at that massive armament in Venice that we looked at from, about 1,000 years before Henry Ford came up with it. But let's forget about that. It doesn't count. And then, what was the real issue? The reality is more complicated. People weren't choosing to ride or not ride in some perfect universe. They were making it in a messy real-world environment. Well, isn't it always a messy real-world environment? That just seems like an excuse. The real problem was that once cars appeared on the road, they could drive on streetcar tracks, and the streetcars could no longer operate efficiently. Once just 10% or so of the people were driving, the tracks were so crowded that the streetcars weren't making their schedules, Norton says. In some places like Chicago, streetcars retained dedicated rights-of-way and they survived. Pretty much anywhere else, they were doomed, with 160,000 cars cramming onto Los Angeles streets in the 1920s. And how many cars do we think are cramming on there now in the 2020s? Mass transit riders complained of massive traffic jams and hour-long delays. And so, once again, it seems as though, yes, this change in transportation systems, and you can even find Dean Kamen talking about this when he was inventing the Segway, lamenting the fact that our last mile to travel within point A to point B in cities is broken because of these cars. What's more, in many cities, the streetcars' contracts required them to keep the pavement on the road surrounding the tracks in good shape. So wait a minute. What they're saying then is that basically there was regulation that hamstrung all of these streetcar companies or these trolley companies, and paying for the maintenance got more and more difficult, and they were also locked into a 5-cent fare, which wasn't indexed to inflation. Wait a minute. Why in the heck would any company that's even trying to maintain its basic operation not factor in inflation at any point in time? Unless we're to believe that inflation was not an issue in the distant past? Very strange. After World War I, the value of 5 cents plummeted, but streetcars had to get approval from municipal commissions for any fare hikes. Oh, so regulation. So isn't it interesting how the government, only in Chicago do they impose regulations so the streetcar could actually not be interfered with by the automobile, and yet everywhere else the automobile made the streetcar impractical. Of course, the automobile also makes itself impractical with all the vast gridlock. You ever try driving around Los Angeles anytime between 9 to 5 on any given day, to include the weekends? And let's not even talk about the 405 or the 210. And isn't this intriguing? The public had little sympathy for the traction magnates who'd entered into these contracts. Today, many progressives and urbanists are boosters of streetcars, but back then they were often seen as a bastion of corruption, because the railroad wasn't, and automobiles were certainly not seen as a bastion of corruption, at least not in the 1920s. There's always an excuse for it, isn't there? Especially because of their owner's history of violent strike breaking. Yes, of course. The quiet death of the streetcar. Because of these factors, some streetcar companies began going into bankruptcy as early as the 1920s, even though the article starts by telling us that was the heyday, but whatever. Again, conflicting accounts. Isn't it also intriguing that as they fought to stay alive during the Great Depression, many companies invested in buses which were cheaper and more flexible? Initially, they operated mainly as feeder systems to bring commuters to the end of lines, but as time went on, they began to replace some lines entirely. So it seems as though we have this account that, in reality, the way they developed the system with automobiles and the facilitation of the system by government, it was designed to remove the trolleys. Now, is that a conspiracy theory? No. The article will tell us it's simply because it was the will of the people. The will of the people to have an automobile. And I'll be honest with you all, I'm a great fan of the automobile. I appreciate driving around in my car, especially on a nice county road, and being able to go as fast as I want to. Okay, well, within the speed limit, but you know what I mean. You have the ability to rapidly move around. But yet, whenever you go into a city, you may as well be walking, especially if you're anywhere in Los Angeles, Chicago. It just doesn't work. I mean, Dean Kamen wasn't lying. He was absolutely right when he said the last mile in the city was broken. So what killed the streetcar? The simplest answer is that it couldn't compete with a car on an extremely uneven playing field. Oh, okay. You see, there's always a simple answer. It's not a conspiracy theory. It just couldn't compete with a car, and the people exercised their will. And let's not even talk about where the car came from or how it could have mixed with the trolley. Imagine if the government had actually imposed regulations across the nation in all the cities where they retained the trolley or the streetcar or the tram. How different would things have been? But what's your opinion? I would love to hear it in the comments. What do you think the trolley, the streetcar, or the tram originally was? And why do you think we don't have the streetcar today, even though we have a focus on restoring and installing cleaner energy? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
I'd love to stay, but